Hello, we are here. We just hit record, so I'm going to say hello. We are talking about our topic for today. The initial thing I pitched, and I'm sort of like reading this as we go. Two things I pitched. Well, thing I pitched, I guess, for now would be basically talking about doing a presentation of some extent, basically like doing an assessment and what are some of the challenges that you would run into. It would be, it is really it's out of order for what we're doing. I do think it's part of the developer journey, um, but I think it's also going from instead of starting early developer journey, we're sort of jumping ahead to later development journey, and it's mostly because it was on my mind. I can't imagine why, but it was something that is near and dear to us right now, and I really think that this is one of those things that is, in general, a good conversation point about communicating stuff because I think we have, even if you're not doing like a full blown assessment of something, you are often asked to talk about your app that you did, or maybe do a demo, especially now in the world of agile and scrums and sprints. You are asked on a regular basis, and maybe this is how we narrow it down a little bit more to a developer, but you are asked on a regular basis to demo your stuff and to walk through it. And how do you show this, and how do you address the needs of varying audiences? Now, an assessment does get a little bit more definitely into advanced developer stuff because it's where you're like, okay, you may be talking to a CEO or something like that, but there's a lot of little pieces to this that I think are useful for us to talk through, which is why I pitched this out. I think we could come back around to it later, but that was sort of where I was going with this one. Um,
Yeah, and I was reading your notes on that, and I I kind of feel that this is more an advanced topic. Like we probably for the assessment piece talk more about that maybe 15 episodes in or 20 episodes in. At this point, though, if we want to kind of stick to this theme a little bit, though, we could get into all right, so we kind of talked about going from coder to developer, problem solving. So the next progression of that, if we follow your train of thought, but bring it back to the earlier part of their journey, let's talk about, all right, so now that you're solving problems, now you're working in an environment where you have to solve these problems. How do you go about researching how to solve that problem, how to put together like a proof of concept, and then how to pitch it to whoever as your solution?
I think that works. I think that's something, and this is one of those areas I think we'll come back to a couple times from different points of view. So I like that. So we'll work. So this episode, which actually sort of goes to the second one that I was thinking about, that'll be that next episode. Um, so sort of basically start with, we got a problem. All right, how do we actually show that we're solving that problem before we solve the problem effectively? Which is things like proof of concepts and demos and those kinds of things. And then the second one I wanted to get into anyway, so I think may dovetail well with that, is sort of okay, what happens when you say, hey, here's the problem we're going to solve and here's how we're going to solve it. And somebody's like, no, 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 we're going to do it completely differently. And dealing with that, because sometimes it's a customer and it's like, customer's always right. Sometimes it's somebody at work where it's like, okay, this person's always picking a different path. How do I deal with this? It's not quite the poison pill person where it's somebody that you're just poisoned everything. It's just they are your nemesis or something like that, where it's like you get into stuff and people will, especially early on, you're going to see that in a company where this is the right way to go. This is like, you've been taught, this is how we have to do it. And they go a different direction. So it's, how do you work within that? And, it's the kinds of things like making sure that you don't get yourself in a bad situation because you've overreacted to it. And it's also, and some of it's, keeping an open mind and some things like that, and figuring out where you can learn and where you can work within maybe a very different framework than what you're used to. So,
Yeah, that actually is near and dear to my heart because I'm dealing with that right now. I'm working on a program. I have a very tight deadline. It's with creating worksheets. I'm having to create a new worksheet on the fly. Right now, we don't have the backend data yet, so I'm having to mock all this. And I come to find out that all the data objects that we're using to generate the reports are not domain objects. They're reusing the DTOs that we received from all of our API calls, and they were not reformed into a structured format. So I'm having to go through hoops to build essentially the domain object or the report from all these different locations of data.
Yeah, this is actually something. This came in on the request line from Timothy from Oshkosh, Wisconsin. There was like brought it up, and I was like, one, I'm going to use your name, and two, that's a really good idea because that is something we run into. And he mentioned that, yeah, you may know something about that.
Yeah, no, I like that.
Okay, so that's where we're going to go. We're going to start with like, how do you show you solved your problem? Hello and welcome back. We are continuing our season where we're talking about the developer journey. In building a better developer, you start from obviously not being better to being better. And notice you never actually finish that journey to better. Before we get on going too far, though, I need to introduce myself. My name is Rob Broadhead, one of the founders of Developreneur, Building Better Developers. Also founder of RB Consulting, where we do all kinds of nice little software stuff, mostly integration, simplification, and automation. And sometimes it's communication, like with the man on the other side. Michael, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hey, everyone. My name is Michael Malash. I'm another co-founder of Developreneur. I'm also the founder of Envision QA, where we help small and mid-sized businesses build custom software, do software assessments, and also help small clinical offices build medical solutions that help their systems.
This episode, we're sort of continuing on a little bit of our journey as we've gone through some stuff. We've talked about problem solving, essentially, last episode around. And so this episode, we're really going to talk about how do you solve the problem without solving the problem, because this is something we do run into on a regular basis. We may have to write it up. We may have to design something. There may be a proof of concept or a demo or something like that. And it's how far, some of it is how far do you go? Where do you draw a line between doing something and doing it for real? And this is often going to be a situation that will come up if you end up in that side hustle industry where you're putting proposals together and things like that. Somebody's going to say, hey, can you do this for me? And you'll say, yes, I can. And this is how I can do it. And then they'll ask for a little bit more. And sometimes they'll ask for a little more, and a little more, a little more. And the next thing you know, you've halfway built their thing. It's like, look, we've already built it. We've already put maybe hundreds of hours into this. At some point, it's like, fish or cut bait. You're either accepting this project and we're moving on, or we're not. And you also don't want to give too much away. I mean, it'd be like a lawyer. If they ask you for, you're like, hey, can I get a little bit of advice? And basically you ask them for all the advice you would need to be a lawyer, then they've just given it all away. And it's like, well, wait a minute, that's not free advice anymore. You've just stolen my knowledge. And it's not quite to that level, but it is something along that ways, because you need to step into a problem, start working that problem, maybe think through some of the solution, put some of those pieces in place, maybe even test them out through a proof of concept, and then move forward. Because you don't want to put too much into it if, one, the project's going to be canceled, or two, they're going to go somewhere else, or three, it's not a good solution. Sometimes we get into this and we say, here's a problem, here's a solution. We get sort of into it, and it becomes not feasible. An example that I've run into lately is working with a tool that was gathering data. And we looked at, initially it was like, well, here's how you're going to gather data. Cool, that makes sense. It's like, we're going to go from these sources, and this is what we're going to get, and this is going to be awesome, and we're going to pull this all this stuff in. Well, it turns out as we get a little further into it, a couple of those sources, their APIs were too expensive. It was too limited. It was going to be too much of a cost. So we had to go like a different route. And then we go the different route, and we're actually getting too much data because we're doing stuff like search engine hits that are bringing back, pages and pages of data that might be useful, but probably aren't. And it takes a lot of resources to mine that data to try to find the bits of information that we're trying to. And so in each of these, it's effectively a proof of concept kind of thing. It's like go in it, grab some data, put it together. Let's see how it looks. Let's run it a few times. Let's run it for something in a, like a small batch of data, and then grow to something bigger and see, does that scale? And that's usually where you're going to find out the issue, which is my first recommendation in this, is that you start small, super, super small, like, one or two records or something. It's basically prove the process once. Can it be done once in the most simple kind of situation? And then let's see if we can generalize that so we can open that up a little bit more and make it a general solution. And then try to look at what does that general solution look like if you apply it to a larger, or maybe a real world, maybe not fully real world, but a closer to real world set of data. For example, if you're building something that all it is taking in data from a CSV file and it's parsing it and putting it somewhere, start with like 3 records. Just go in, do 3 records, run through those, see if that works right. If it does, okay, now let's open it up to 400 records or 1,000 records or something like that. And then maybe it grows to, okay, I'm going to give it 10 different files and they've each got 1,000 records. Then you're like, okay, this scales. And also, whether it scales or not, you are going to be able to see, even in the most positives, say that, okay, this is the growth curve of it. If I've got 10 records, it takes a microsecond. If I've got 100 records, it takes 3 microseconds or whatever it is. And so you'll be able to see if that progression continues, is this some sort of curve that's going to just go off into space? Or is this something that's like a nice, curve or a nice progression line that I'm like, oh, cool. I know that I can do 4 million records of this in X amount of time. So the first thing is, with your solution, when you're doing that proof of concept, the first thing is, like, what are you trying to prove? That's right. What you trying to prove, man? It's not one of those. It's not like you're going to get your fists up or anything, but it is something where it is, I have a problem. I've got a solution, and making sure that you're sort of, as you're going through this, you're keeping in your head, or you're keeping the questions you want to answer is, where would this solution not be useful? And use those things to drive, your demo or your POC. I'll throw it to you because I've talked too much already. So what are your thoughts or maybe recommendation you have?
Yeah. So to kind of build on that, so I liked your idea, as you're starting out, you're trying to figure out that proof of concept, you're trying to figure out how something works. The example you gave is a very good example of test-driven development. Figure out your problem and then work backwards to your solution. So like you said, start with a small data set, make sure that works, and then work your way up to the larger data set. Tacking onto that, while you're doing your proof of concept as well, when you're working on trying to figure out this problem or how to solve this problem, you don't always have to go out and build a solution. Sometimes you can go out and find APIs or projects out there that already exist that solve the problem for you. You don't have to always go out and reinvent the wheel, but there are cases where sometimes that's a necessity. Like if you're in healthcare, maybe you can't use these APIs because they're not secure enough, or they might be open and you might run into some HIPAA violations or some SOX compliance issues. So don't just look at, hey, how do I solve this problem with my building it from scratch? Can I use other tools to build this? Are they compliant with the environment I'm working in? The other thing is, as you're putting this together, I had a very good case of this, and this was years ago, Robin. I think this was even before I first met you at the company we worked at. I was approached with an idea of how can we take this billing center model that we had within the company. We had like 20 some billing centers across the country that was handling all the claims information, the customer information, the order information for medical supplies. And the whole problem with the process was it was very manual. So I was tasked with, okay, how can we take this manual process and automate it? How can we turn this into a program where instead of people passing papers or binders around, how can we turn this into a desktop or web application that we can solve, that we can essentially eliminate this problem? So we started out analyzing what the business did. What is the problem? What are the processes in this particular case. We were trying to replicate what someone was already doing, but we were trying to do it in a software model. As we went through this process, they were like, well, here, let's just start with the binder. And we literally just replicated the worksheets that they essentially had into a web application. Everyone loved it. It looked great. Problem you run into with this sometimes is as you're building these solutions, suddenly you find yourself in a situation where you are now with a live application. So somehow along this journey, you've gone from this proof of concept to, oops, you're now live. You're now supporting something that's not quite done. But to get there, this does happen, but you have to be mindful, like Rob said, as you're going through this process, you don't want to give away everything, but you also have to be mindful that as you're putting the pieces together, that you don't find yourself in a situation where, oh, someone higher up sees this and says, great, let's stick it out there live tomorrow. And you're like, whoa, I'm not ready. This is all mock data. Let's take a step back. How would you, from your perspective, Rob, how would you avoid that situation? What advice could you give to our viewers?
So that, to answer that question specifically, this is something that we see on a fairly, I used to see it, I think, more than we do now. But as I'm thinking about it, no, I actually do see it fairly regularly, because we have a whole process now that is built to address that. If you are in the world of Agile and Scrum in particular, the whole point is that at the end of a sprint, you have a deliverable. You have something that technically is useful software at the end of every single sprint. And so it actually, instead of circumventing that or trying to see that as a problem, it owns it and says, cool, this is something we need to deal with, and actually says, all right, we can actually get the train on the tracks and start moving forward. And it seems like a bad analogy, but they're like, we can start building onto the train as we go. And sometimes that's very difficult, but it does allow that. And actually particularly in the web application world and some of those, even a little bit desktop, but definitely in the SaaS world, it makes a lot of sense, because you can put together a nice framework of stuff, a really focused solution, and then build on top of that. And now this does sort of step into this proof of concept thing. Sometimes the proof of concept is, like, for example, this is one the application I was just working on. The first proof of concept was like a page. It's just, you bring up a page, you enter some data in, you hit a button, it goes and does some stuff, it kicks results out. Very simple, not very pretty, but it turned out to be almost the entire first phase of the project. And so it was like, oh, okay, we're just going to add on this and this and this and this. Now, when we started to add on, that was when we started having problems. Now, this is where there are some very powerful tools out there. Now, some people go zero code approaches. There are some of the things out there that will allow you to do or even like a Figma or something like that, where you have images, you have a clickable demo, you can make it look, you can roughly approximate like user experience and look and feel and all that kind of good stuff. And it allows you to make this a selling point as opposed to like a point of caution. Now, before I don't want to miss one of the things that Michael brought up was the idea of, it really is almost a precursor to this point, is when you're solving that problem, one of the things that I think it is, especially these days, because the problems are not unique very often. They may be specific to you. You may have a specific need, but generally speaking, there's a lot of stuff out there that are also general problems that everybody sees them, especially when you go to like in a specific silo, like healthcare. It has its whole family of problems that almost everybody in healthcare will talk about it. They know it, they exist. It's just, that's part of what it is. Likewise in finance or automotive, or you name it, real estate, you name it, whatever it is, there's that set of problems. And there are billions, okay, maybe not billions, lots and lots, more than 3 developers out there in the world that are cranking through this stuff. And there's commercial software out there. That's one of the things I think that if nothing else, when we were going through all of those interviews and that long season or two, there are a lot of people we talked to that had very niche software services and products that they did, but they also had a large number of customers. So it makes sense in the ancient world of there's build versus buy. And I think that still exists to some extent, but also there is the proof of concept, the partial solution. A lot of times that is you go out and maybe you buy, but you can customize, or, it's buy and extend or buy and customize, or maybe open source and customize. There's different levels of risk, of costs, and of return of an investment, and all these there's a lot of factors that go into these. But when you're considering your solution, and maybe this is part of what your proof of concept is really proving, does it make sense for us to build this, or does it make more sense to buy it, or does it make more sense to go to one of these products that's out there that provides it? And a lot of times, like, I've gone through several RFP processes where that was really upfront. That was sort of the front loaded thing, was, do we actually go to an RFP? And if we do, we need to know, or it's very helpful to know, this is what it's going to cost for us to build it. This is what we see in the market. And here's what we're actually looking for. Because sometimes you are looking for, I need this solution. I need a product that I can get off the shelf that gets me 80% of the way there. But to be useful to me, these are explicit customizations or features that I need to get me across the finish line for myself. Now, I took a while and I went off on a rabbit trail. So I do want to swing back around and say, did that answer the question the way you're looking for, and allow you to tack on to that if you for a follow-up?
Yeah. And a lot of those situations, now I know we touched on Agile and some more complicated things. We'll get into more depth of those along the journey here, but that's the idea. The problem, as you addressed through using particular development frameworks or development models like Agile, is those are designed to prevent that. But there are still situations where, hey, I've got this idea or I've got this problem. I start working it, but you could be working in a silo, and suddenly, oops, you now have the solution. And like I said, you're now live. So you do run into situations where you do come across kind of one-offs where you kind of fall outside of the traditional model. Could be by chance. It could just be happenstance. But those are good things to happen, because when you run across that, it's good and bad. It's good because, yes, you've solved the problem. People like your solution. They're ready to go run with it. But sometimes that's, we got to learn to walk before we run. But sometimes you're running before you're walking. It's like, whoops, you're already out the door, gone. And it's like, what just happened? But don't be afraid of those. Thrive on those. I love looking up new technology. So how does that work? It's like taking the TV apart and trying to put it back together. It may not always work, but you figure out how the inner workings work. And so the next time something breaks, you can figure out how to move on, how to make it better, how to integrate that next project. Or, go to your boss and say, hey, I heard you had this problem. Let me take a stab at it. Go figure out how to fix this and come up with a solution for you. Let me do a POC.
And that, I guess, just some closing thoughts on this one as we wrap this one up, is that you do want to embrace that. If somebody comes to you and says, hey, I need you to solve a problem, and you give them a solution, if it's something that looks like they're going to push that out there sooner rather than later, then that may be okay. That may be awesome. You may suddenly be able to retire, a lot earlier than you thought you were going to, or it may be a major headache. And so when you run into those situations, and I think this is something we will come back to and focus more in another episode, but there is, in a lot of cases, there is a cost once you are live with things like updating data, maintaining data, replicating data, and all that kind of stuff, because now as you build, and then even changing data, this is something particularly changing that I have seen in a lot of projects. And there's one in particular that I worked with this customer, and we had a solution, and we're like, cool, we're going to do this. And we got further down the road and we changed the solution. They're like, wow, we really need it this way. And I was like, cool, that makes sense. The problem was we didn't really think through, didn't really understand how much impact that was going to make. It's one of those where like, oh, it's going to be a couple changes here, a couple changes there, field here, report there. But it wasn't until we got further into it and realized that there was, relationships and things within the data, particularly with the existing data, that we now had to migrate out of, and it was a very painful, tedious process to do it. So there's some things like that you want to be aware of, that you may be biting off more than you can chew, and particularly when you want to get that solution out, they want to get the solution out. Sometimes it's easier to say, you know what, we can punt that down the road and we'll tackle that data later. But in particular, data and data structures have their own weight and momentum, and there may be a migration you have to do in your future. And we've seen it in every piece of software out there that goes through major releases. Eventually, there's a watershed or something where you have to actually migrate into the new system. What you don't have to do is migrate to another podcast, because we're here. You can take everything you've heard from us from all of these hundreds of episodes and carry it forward into the next episode. So check us out wherever you subscribe, wherever you do your podcast. You can check us out on YouTube. You can check us out on developreneur.com. You can shoot us an email at info@developreneur.com. Like somebody we're going to highlight, we'll say, in the next episode, where we've gotten requests from out there and got some good questions that we can talk about. We would love to take those from you as well. That being said, I want to respect your time. So go out there and have yourself a great day, great week, and we will talk to you next time. And bonus information. Is there any bonus material you're thinking of?
Yeah, actually. So as you were kind of giving your final thoughts, just kind of jumped into my mind. As you're doing proof of concept, one of the other things to be mindful, and we all do, it's like, oh, great, let's go figure this out. So you quickly, or maybe slowly, figure out the solution to the problem. Make sure you are a little methodical with your documentation, your structure, and your notes as you go through the process of your POC. There's been many times I've been bad about this. I've seen a lot of people where you get so excited, you get to that solution, and you're like, go back and you try to maintain it, and you have spaghetti code, or you have no idea where the heck you found that solution, or this one thing that is what you need to do it. As you go through the process, either keep track of your browser history, keep track of your bash history, but just take the time, maybe give yourself some checkpoints at the beginning, at least, to document what you're doing. Create a README file, but just do something to keep track of everything you're doing every so often. So when you do get to the end of the POC, if it happens to go live, you have a way of maintaining this, not like, oh my God, how the hell did I do this moment.
Yeah, that's where I've been in that conversation. The refactoring can get to be pretty nasty. The biggest and this becomes multiplied as an issue if you have multiple developers. For example, I've got an app I was just looking through not too long ago that we built. We built it quick. We did a lot of stuff. We're making a lot of changes. And I was looking through the code, and I was really confused because we had 3 copies of the same method. The same function was sitting there. They're basically almost back to back to back. And somewhere along the way, we had missed that, hey, we already have that. So code review would have caught that theoretically. Also, there should be some level of seeing that if you're really focusing on like pull requests and committing code. Again, it does go back to some level of code review. But these are kind of things as you're building them, try to keep some notes, use the document, particularly if you've got built-in documentation tools like JavaDoc or something like that. Is just, you should be in the habit of doing that kind of documentation. At the very least, like I do like daily stand-ups. If you've got a little status or something that you can go see what was your stand-ups, then maybe you can see what was done along the way. Or use, like, if you're using Trello or Jira or you name it, one of those tools, then you can occasionally look back at stuff like, did we already do that or didn't we? And then even within the code, just like there's a lot of things like that you can do. Again, another episode. But if you start with the basic good habits of being a developer, then those will help you moving forward. That being said,
I'll say one
I'm
more
going to
thing.
let you say something.
The other thing, though, is if you are doing a POC, sometimes this is a new application or a new project. So you may not have all those things in place that Rob said, like Jira, Bitbucket. So what you might want to do is first start out by building a Git repo, build a local Git repo, and do it locally, and make sure that you commit your code often so that you kind of have that running tally of what it is you're doing. What's this change? What's that change? So when you're done, even if it is just a POC, but you decide to refactor it later, you have all those notes you can put into the code as comments, or hopefully you wrote the code cleanly and the code is self-documenting. But sometimes POCs are quick. We're just trying to get it out there, make sure it works, and then come back and see if we can plug it into something bigger.
I agree. I would just say that it should never be that. It should always be like, it's so easy to spin up a repository, especially if you use GitHub. It's going to automatically you can use the template kind of thing. You will have an issue tracker. You will have, your version control. You can do you don't have to go do a bunch of branches or anything like that. You can have a main trunk that you're committing to along the way. You've got comments. Trust me, I have built probably hundreds of demos and proof of concepts, and every one of them exists somewhere in some version control repository somewhere, if nothing else, so that you have a backup of where that stuff is. And particularly, this is almost more important with proof of concepts, because you want to have that history of what did you do. So if that thing grows, you can always go back to something and go, hey, I used to do that, and go find it. It is more important, I would say, starting out, maybe even than it does further down the road. Almost as important as you checking in next time around. We're going to wrap this one up, and we will be back next time. Obviously, you guys are at the right place because you're at YouTube. You get to see our glowing faces while we're talking to you. Come on back. Or if for some reason you can't stand our faces, we won't take offense. We get it. We have to look at them all the time. You can use a podcast, and then it's pure audio, and then all you have to do is just put up with our voices. That being said, go out there and have yourself a great day, and we'll check in with you next time around.